much. Can everybody hear me? I thought it might be nice to be able to get out from behind the podium, so I'll try to do that a little bit as we move through these images. Thanks to Andrew for that introduction. Thanks to Naomi and the foundation. Thanks to everyone at the forum for making me and all of us who have come from afar feel so welcome. Thanks for your hospitality. In terms of the future, I do feel as though I've been able to do a bit of time traveling getting here, not just because we're almost a full day ahead of Los Angeles. It's Wednesday afternoon in LA at the moment, but also because we've just in one trip gone from late spring in Los Angeles, just on the edge of summer, to late fall here in Australia. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I will be talking first about, as Andrew mentioned, I was an architecture critic for almost 15 years at the Los Angeles Times and for many years before that. So talking about this transition that I've just made about a year ago, moving into the mayor's office, and talk about how a kind of analysis of Los Angeles that I developed as a critic and as a professor of the practice at Occidental College, a small liberal arts college in Northeast Los Angeles, how that framework of understanding Los Angeles, its history, and where it's going has helped shape the work that I'm doing now for the city, and talk then in the latter half of my remarks about four particular areas of focus, talking about history and civic memory. It's really important, I think, for us in Los Angeles, a city that has really neglected its history for so long, to think about how to nurture civic memory and a sense of place and the complexities of place to a degree that we haven't done. Second, rethinking the design of the public right-of-way in Los Angeles, another neglected area, from a comprehensive point of view, particularly as climate change accelerates. Third, thinking about new policies for housing, and I think Ratchaporn's presentation on Bangkok we were talking last night, a lot of similarities in terms of the focus of where we're looking at Los Angeles, that is the so-called missing middle, and really thinking about building from the middle out as we try to densify so many of our neighborhoods, particularly our single-family neighborhoods, looking ahead. And finally, as Andrew mentioned, thinking about the future of the Los Angeles River, which looks quite a bit different from the river that's behind us, and has been the scene of so many dystopian movie scenes and car chases. And looking in particular at one site that the city purchased about 18 months ago and is actively trying to turn into a new park and open space along the river. So I start with this image to suggest how much I think I have my work cut out for me in terms of that neglect, and we'll come back to that image. But let's really start with this one. If there's a single emblematic photograph of Los Angeles and its architecture, it is this one by the photographer Julius Schulman from 1960 of Pierre Koenig's Stahl House in the Hollywood Hills, one of the case study houses. And if there was a single focus in my work at the LA Times, and I think this is carrying on into the work that I'm doing for the city, it's really to begin to interrogate some of these images and interrogate the Los Angeles that is exemplified by this photograph. I think there is a sense, particularly from those of you looking at Los Angeles from outside and other parts of the world, that this is a kind of eternal picture of Los Angeles. It's eternally fixed. This is the architecture and the urbanism of the city now and forever. But a lot of the work that I've been doing is suggesting the ways in which that city has a before and that city has an after, and also the ways in which that Los Angeles is heavily constructed and subsidized in all kinds of ways. So this is a picture of Julius Schulman at bottom right, taking an image of the Stahl House as part of that photo shoot. If you look, the pointer doesn't work because it's an LED screen, but if you look at the center of that image, you'll see one of Julius's assistants holding up a branch to give a little green to the image. That was a trick that Julius, who I got to know at the very end of his life, his very long and prolific life, that was a trick that Julius used quite a bit. So I show this image now. This is an image that I really prefer to the one I just showed because it suggests how much these images of Los Angeles have been constructed, and also I sort of feel this way, the way that Julius must have now getting a picture in City Hall of sort of how the sausage is made. I also love how Julius is sort of hanging off the edge of that little wall, the same way that the house is kind of hanging off the hillside of Los Angeles. So it was just over a year ago that the mayor created a new position in City Hall called Chief Design Officer, not Design Czar, as the New York Times had it, and asked me to start thinking in a comprehensive way about urban design, architecture, and planning through the lens of design, given how much investment the city of Los Angeles is now making in its infrastructure, in its public spaces, in its transportation networks, looking ahead to the Olympics, as you heard. And I will get to some of those details. It was a relationship that began between me and the mayor, who's shown here, in the public events series, Third Los Angeles series that I run at Occidental College, as you heard. So this is an image of a conversation that the mayor and I had soon after he was elected for the first time in 2013. He's taking a photograph of a musician that I asked to come on stage, Gabriel Kahane, who had just finished an album of songs called The Ambassador, inspired by the architecture and design history of Los Angeles, for which I had written the liner notes, my first and only experience writing liner notes. And here he is taking a picture, the mayor taking a picture of Gabriel Kahane to post directly from stage to his Instagram account. He's very active on social media. But we had a number of conversations after the mayor was reelected in 2017. He asked if we could do another one of these conversations. He's very literate, engaged, sophisticated about architecture. And so we did that again, and it was in that second conversation in 2017 that we began talking about how other cities have taken on, have addressed this question of how to think about their futures from a urban design, planning, architectural point of view in a more comprehensive way. And it was really around that time that he and I then started talking about the shape that a role of the one that I have now might take. So the mayor has talked about this moment in Los Angeles as a moment of great transition, and indeed it is. He's talked about it as a kind of hinge moment between one LA and the next. And so there's Julius's photograph of the Stahl House again on the left, and on the right is a really important transformational moment, certainly one of the most important moments since I arrived in Los Angeles in 2004 to become the architecture critic of the Los Angeles Times. It's one of the immigration rights protests that filled the streets of Los Angeles, particularly Wilshire Boulevard and Broadway, which is shown here, leading to City Hall. In 2006, in protest in response to pending immigration legislation at the federal level in Washington, it was also very much an announcement that the city and county of Los Angeles were about to become majority Latino, and they both have passed that 50% threshold. But it was also an announcement of, I think, a populace very interested in using the spaces of the city in a new way, despite our historical neglect of the public realm. And that interest is played out in many other ways. We have an open streets festival called Ciclavia, modeled on Ciclovia, the festival in Bogota, Colombia, which began in Los Angeles in 2010 and has been hugely successful in drawing people out into the public realm, closes several miles of boulevards and public streets to car traffic and opens it up to pedestrians and cyclists. In terms of housing, too, we're really seeing a transition from the post-war architecture, not just of the case study houses, but of the kind of landscapes made famous by David Hockney. This is his painting, A Bigger Splash, from 1967, which is remarkable for how depopulated it is. The appeal of this Los Angeles was a kind of retreat from the city. You see the record of human presence in the splash, but the image itself, of course, is completely empty, drained of human presence. And now we're beginning to turn back to the center of Los Angeles and build in a new way, and trying to put a kind of LA, Southern California spin on the notion of infill development. This is a project by Michael Maltzin called One Santa Fe from 2015. Similarly, a project by Barbara Bester called Blackbirds in the Echo Park section of Los Angeles, which was made possible by the small lot subdivision ordinance, which was a policy change which allowed single-family houses to be built in place of condos or apartments. Importantly, though, this kind of density, this kind of infill is only possible in neighborhoods that are already zoned multifamily. So it didn't touch that single-family neighborhood, that zoning that we'll talk about in a bit. Certainly in terms of transportation, in terms of mobility, how we get around the region, there is a remarkable transformation happening At left is the Metro, that's a county transportation agency. That's the map of subway and light rail as it existed essentially when I got to Los Angeles. This is the map at left in the year 2000. At right is the projected map of our transit network in 2028. So it includes 28 new projects that we're hoping to get done by the time the Olympics come back to Los Angeles for the third time, a little less than a decade from now. But as I thought about, as I wrote about, how to frame that transition, particularly as it informs the work that I'm now doing at the city level, and as I read more deeply into the history of Los Angeles, its urban form, it became clear that it was too simple to think about this simply as a binary transition from A to B. And that if you think about, let's start with transportation, all of these basic frameworks in terms of how the city is built, there is a Los Angeles that exists before the post-war city that we all know so well. And it included, in terms of mobility, a streetcar network, privately owned, it's important to say, that could take you across the entire region, all the way from, on the right side of this image, Riverside, what we think of as the Inland Empire in Southern California, all the way to the beach in Venice or Santa Monica, all the way from the top of the San Fernando Valley, from Mount Wilson, all the way down to Long Beach. And those streetcars really, many of them were tied to speculative real estate developments. They really were threaded across the entire massive region. And in fact, some of the new routes we're building, this is the Expo line, which now opened a couple of years ago, connecting downtown with Santa Monica, runs through a lot of the old rights-of-way, which were left over from the streetcar network of the early 20th century. Similarly, in terms of street life, the public realm, what we now call the public right-of-way, there was a Los Angeles that was quite active in terms of its pedestrian life, in terms of what we now think of as multimodal ways of making the city. This is the corner of Broadway and 8th Street and around, that's the Tower Theater, which is from 1928, so this is probably a late 20s image. And it's very easy, these are all images from the collection of the Los Angeles Public Library, to find images, photographs of downtown Los Angeles, which suggest the vitality of the street and pedestrian life. This one of my favorites, showing those streetcar tracks from above. In housing as well, we have a longer, deeper history of multifamily, a kind of architectural experimentation that existed before the single-family house. This is a really important seminal project in Los Angeles by Irving Gill, a modernist who came up north from San Diego and began doing work that in the mid to late teens, this is a project from 1919, was as forward-looking and ruthlessly spare as anything that Loos was doing in Europe, anything that European modernists were doing. This is a project called Horatio West Court. It's in the Ocean Park section of Santa Monica. From 1919, a neighborhood later made famous by the painter Richard Diebenkorn, who lived and painted in that part of Santa Monica. So, and this is a sixplex, by the way, 6 units, 4 units toward the front, 2 smaller units in the back, arranged along a very narrow spine leading to a garage in the back. So it began to become clear to me that it made more sense to think about 3 distinct periods of LA's urban architectural history. The first LA, this LA of streetcars and expansion, a moment when LA's Anglo elites, importantly, were trying to whitewash the histories, both the indigenous histories and the histories of Mexican and Spanish California, and establish cultural prominence that they enjoyed for much of the 20th century. Existing, that first Los Angeles from around the 1880s, which is really the beginning of modern LA, to World War II. The second Los Angeles, the LA that produced all of the tropes and stereotypes that we're all familiar with, the city of cars, freeways, single-family houses, backyard swimming pools, running from World War II through the end of the 20th century, more or less. And that it made more sense to think about this new city that was beginning to emerge as the third Los Angeles, a city that began to take shape around 2000. In the first decade of the 21st century, that immigration rights protest that I showed, one of the turning points, and there are a few other sort of milestones marking the emergence of this new city. You can think of it in terms of housing, of course, as well. Looking back to the multifamily experiments of the first LA, giving way to the elbow room, the deeply privatized landscape of second Los Angeles in the post-war city, and now a city really trying and often struggling to produce new typologies, new models of living that make more sense looking forward. And it's important to say that that middle LA, that second Los Angeles, while appealing, was exclusionary in all sorts of ways. So the image of the Julius Schulman case study photograph of the stall house that I showed, it's only recently that scholarship has begun to tell us that the neighborhood where that house was built had very strict racial covenants that would have made it impossible for any family of color to purchase that house. And in a really ironic twist, it turns out that because the Stahl family was trying to get a mortgage on a very progressive experimental work of architecture, they were unable to get a mortgage from any of the larger banks in Los Angeles. And the loan that the only loan they were able to get ultimately was from a small family bank in South Los Angeles owned by and started by an African-American family. Again, to finance a house in a part of the city where redlining would have made it impossible for the owners of that bank to buy a house or to live. Or even in some cases to spend the night. There were very restrictive so-called sundown restrictions in many parts of Los Angeles, in Culver City, and parts of Los Angeles proper, where African Americans were not legally allowed to spend the night, let alone purchase property. So as appealing as that David Hockney image is, as appealing as all of those Julius Schulman photographs of that second LA with all of its elbow room and freedom, it came with a lot of exclusion, a lot of rules that allowed certain families to build wealth and equity and other families to be shut out from that sort of wealth building process. So as I have made this transition into my new role, it has become important to me for that reason to think about history and civic memory, as I mentioned, in some new ways and really make that an important part of what I'm doing. I've begun to convene a so-called committee on memory, which is architects, historians, artists. I have the privilege in my new job to bring very smart and thoughtful people together to think about these issues. So a good friend of mine, Bill Deverell, who's a historian at USC, is helping me put together a sort of committee to think about these issues of history and civic memory. And one of the projects we've begun working on is thinking about how to build a new preservation framework for the buildings of the recent past. So not the modernist landmarks of Pierre Koenig and others from the case study program, but buildings by the so-called LA school architects of the 1980s and 1990s. This is an image from Venice Beach, a photo shoot for an Italian magazine in 1980 with, from left, Fred Fisher, Coy Howard, I don't know the dog's name. That's Eric Owen Moss with the very wide tie. That is, Robert Mangurian is second from left, Eric Owen Moss, Coy Howard, Craig Hodgetts, Tom Main, second from right, and Frank Gehry from his mustachio period. And this is a really significant image in all sorts of ways. It suggests how exclusive and exclusively white and male that club of architects was. It suggests the way that European photographers, for example, the editors who had commissioned this photo shoot, saw the work that was happening in LA at that moment in Venice and Santa Monica as being on a kind of frontier, and it was very symbolically significant that the architects were asked to pose on the beach, because from a European and from an East Coast American perspective, Los Angeles was the end of this exploration of the vast continent, the sort of end product of manifest destiny. But I think in the years that I've been living in Los Angeles, that perspective has really radically changed. And we've begun to also realize that for folks who immigrated, who came from Latin America to Los Angeles or came from Asia, and those were really the places that from which waves of immigration really remade Los Angeles and the tail end of the second LA. Los Angeles for them is the northern end of the southern hemisphere. It's the northern capital of the southern hemisphere. If you're coming from Asia, it's the easternmost capital of Asia, seen in a sort of more global perspective. And so an image like this can look very limited in retrospect in terms of the perspective that it offers. And Mayor Garcetti talks frequently about trying to understand Los Angeles from that perspective. What it means if you're looking to LA from Lima, Peru, or from Mexico City, or from Bangkok, from a Chinese or Japanese or Korean city. So I've begun thinking about how we can put together a kind of database of the most important work from this period and That's difficult. This is a project that left an infamous Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise on Western Avenue by Elise Grinstein and Jeffrey Daniels, and at Right, an early project by Tom Main and Morphosis on the beach in City Hall. Thinking about how to protect these buildings, which will be difficult because these buildings were very interested in challenging bourgeois notions of good taste or beauty when they were new. They were difficult to love in some ways, easy to appreciate, perhaps difficult to love. And so building a preservation framework for the most important of those buildings will be complicated. And that's a project that I've begun doing with some colleagues to map the most important of those buildings. We did a public event not long ago at which the mayor spoke to begin thinking about what that framework would look like. And of course, as I mentioned, that's needs to be considered in the larger context of a city which has been infamous for whitewashing or forgetting its past, for being a kind of amnesiac city. This is a book by Norman Klein from 1997, which is one of the most important book-length efforts to assess that amnesiac history in Los Angeles. Of course, artists often get there first. This is a project from a series of works that the painter Ed Ruscha made beginning of the late 1970s, which suggests that same notion of Los Angeles as a city too impatient to think about its own past, right, and always looking ahead to the future. When it comes to the Olympics, as we plan for the 2028 Olympics, we also have to look back at our own history. We had the Olympics in 1932. And from a design point of view, the strategy for the 1932 Olympics had quite a bit to do with the urban realm, with corridors, public space. It was the first time we planted palm trees along our boulevards in a systematic way. Olympic Boulevard in Los Angeles is called that because the 1932 Olympics were the 10th Olympiad, and that we changed the name of 10th Street in Los Angeles to Olympic Boulevard. So there is a way in which the history of urban design around the Olympics has to do with public space, has to do with thinking about corridors, as opposed to architectural icons, individual venues, the kinds of white elephants that cities like Beijing and others have produced and are now struggling to think about what to do with going forward. The design strategy for the 1984 Olympics was even more influential. It's something that young designers continue to look back to. It was designed by this woman, Deborah Sussman, a graphic designer who came out of the office of Charles and Ray Eames. She worked with the architect John Jurdy on a series of really remarkable, very pragmatic, temporary structures that were meant to be hugely optimistic, forward-looking, but also very economical, temporary, meant to be dismantled quite easily when the 2 weeks of the games were over. Significantly, in terms of what I was saying about Los Angeles as the northernmost capital of Latin America and the easternmost capital of Asia, this color palette for the Olympics, to go back a bit, was drawn quite explicitly in the way that Deborah Sussman framed it from Latin America and from Asia, and it was very much an attempt to announce that Los Angeles was becoming a Latino and an Asian as opposed to an Anglo city. So then back to this image. The second area of focus for me, and this will be a real focus for this year, my second year in the position, is thinking about how we can repair the design of the public realm and thinking about a comprehensive strategy for what we call the public right-of-way. So it may be a kind of master plan for the public right-of-way. We're still working on the nomenclature, but the idea is to think about this space and think about how we might design it with a more comprehensive strategy in mind, particularly in terms of equity and in terms of climate change and in terms of the pressures that new technology, new forms of mobility are putting on all aspects of this public right-of-way. So as you can see from these images, both from South Los Angeles, we are making up for and confronting many decades of neglect as we invested in the private car, the freeway, the single-family house, the whole privatized infrastructure of the second Los Angeles and the amenities that go with that. We neglected the basic design of the public right-of-way. And of course, those issues become more crucial as we look ahead to accelerating, intensifying climate change and more days across much of Los Angeles of intense heat. We're one of those cities where We have to think about and grapple with sea level rise on the coast, but we also, further inland, have to think quite a bit about cooling and a strategy that will allow us to use the public realm that we're investing in more effectively and draw people to those spaces. This is part of a new tree canopy study that a group called Tree People did in Los Angeles. I'll just point your attention to number one in that list of key findings in terms of equity, this notion that in the city of LA, 18% of the city's tree canopy grows where only 1% of the city's population lives. So any of you who have spent any time in Los Angeles will know that we certainly have pockets of great shade and beautifully designed urban spaces. They tend to be in pockets of wealth around the city. They tend to be landscapes that are planted, irrigated, or maintained, sometimes all three, by private homeowners or private groups, as opposed to the poverty of the urban design tree canopy and the kinds of spaces that I've just shown you photographs of. So as part of the work that I do at Occidental College, I'm continuing to do this Third LA series of public events, this time co-sponsored by the mayor's office and the college. And we did an event, one of our events this year was precisely thinking about this issue, shade as an equity issue in an era of climate change in Los Angeles. Another part of that focus is thinking about the future of the gas station. So I'm working on a design competition with a group called the LA Clean Tech Incubator to imagine, first of all, what we do with these emblematic gas stations, so many of which occupy important corner locations across the city in economically and environmentally challenged neighborhoods often, but they've also produced some of our most emblematic architecture. This is a gas station by Jin Wang, a Chinese-American architect who worked in William Pereira's office, that was designed for a site at LAX, at the airport, was moved to Beverly Hills. So thinking about what we do with the gas stations as gas goes away and electrification intensifies, but also thinking about what the charging station of the future looks like. To what extent charging station is a public space, to what extent is it a retail space. And significantly, while gas stations have been fixed as an architectural type for essentially a century, the charging station will have to, from the very beginning, be a flexible building type because charging times are going to come down, continue to come down. So what might take 45 minutes, what might offer you time to have a meal at a charging station or nearby, within a few minutes may be the time only that it takes to have a cup of coffee. And so we need a building type in terms of the charging station for electric vehicles that will accommodate that sort of shift. We also, like many cities across the United States and across the world now, are grappling with what to do with dockless scooters and the freedom that they bring and also the challenge they bring in terms of safety, liability, where they go, where people park them. So this is an early mock-up of a decal that our Department of Transportation has been putting down on sidewalks, suggesting where people should park these scooters. And I'm working with colleagues in the DOT to think of a design strategy for this kind of signage that could really reflect Los Angeles and reflect a sort of graphic design sensibility of Los Angeles. I'm also working with the Bureau of Street Lighting we're redesigning our standard street lighting pole, which is called the 953. That's a model number that was new to me for the first time since the 1950s. So that's the model that you can see, one of the taller ones at left there. This is from an installation by an artist named Sheila Klein from 1993. It's called Vermonica because it was installed in the thin median of a surface parking lot at the corner of Vermont Avenue and Santa Monica Boulevard in front of a Staples big box store. So in other words, quintessential LA territory. And this shows the range of street lighting pole design that we've been working on. And so we are just beginning conversations with the Bureau of Street Lighting about what our standard lighting pole might look like going forward. But as you can see from this image, and I'm sure this is true for most Australian cities as well, the number of agencies that touch on the right-of-way that have some kind of authority in this space between buildings is really vast, and those departments don't always talk to or communicate with one another, which is why it seems to me that there's a need and perhaps an obligation for this more comprehensive design strategy for the right-of-way. So just to look at a few of these, we have BSS, that's the Bureau of Street Services, working on street cleaning. We have Bureau of Sanitation, BOS, working on drainage. One of the things I've learned over the last year is about 2,000 new acronyms, many of which are shown here. BSS is responsible with the LA DOT, the Department of Transportation, for bus benches, and on and on. There's the street lighting pole that I mentioned. That's the silhouette of the 953 that we're trying to redesign. That's something that goes through the Bureau of Street Lighting, LA Department of Water and Power. BID is Business Improvement District of a kind that exists all over the country. So some of this interest in the strategy comes from language that the mayor himself has used. This is a story that was in the New York Times about a year before I took my job, in which the mayor and I were both independently quoted. And he was saying to this reporter from the New York Times that as he was thinking about creating a position of chief design officer, he wanted somebody who could look, as he put it, at every bus stop, curb, utility box, every facade, every subway portal, at a moment when we're investing so heavily in the public spaces of Los Angeles, as we're trying to draw people out of their cars, as we're thinking about a more equitable distribution of cooling and shade, as we're thinking about new transportation networks, as climate change and technology put new pressures on that right-of-way. I think the mayor and I share the notion that the opinion that we need to be thinking about that space in a connected way. So the third area of focus I mentioned is housing. We've just been through, across the state of California, a very intense debate, which is ongoing, about proposed legislation in Sacramento at the state capitol called SB 50, Senate Bill 50. It was legislation that was authored by a state senator in San Francisco named Scott Wiener. It had an earlier iteration last year when it was called SB 827, came back this year in slightly modified form as SB 50, and it called for dramatically upzoning parts of Los Angeles around transit and in jobs-rich and housing-poor or lower-density neighborhoods, to really begin to address the chronic undersupply of housing that we have in Los Angeles. We downzone a lot of neighborhoods in LA in the 1980s as a result of a slow growth movement and a backlash against the increasing immigration and population growth in Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s. And we never adjusted that zoning, and so as a result, we have a deficit by most analyses of about 1 million housing units across Los Angeles County. So in terms of where our population growth went, we should have produced about 1 million more housing units than we did. And that is one of the reasons we face the housing affordability and homeless crisis that we do in Los Angeles, in the city and county. So SB 50, has been very controversial. It has been shelved for the time being in Sacramento, but it did open up, and it will probably come back in a new form next year. It did open up the conversation about housing equity, about the future of the single-family neighborhood in some really important ways. So one project that I'm thinking about is a design competition that we hope to launch in the fall, looking at bringing triplexes and fourplexes into the single-family fabric in ways that would both respect the architectural history of that neighborhood, the connection to landscape, the essential scale of those neighborhoods, while also dramatically increasing the access to living in those desirable parts of the city. So Gill and other architects really suggested the way in which this architecture is in our DNA. And all of the research and the data that we're looking at now suggests that, as we heard from Bangkok, building towers at a certain height can do a little bit in terms of bringing down average rents, but the most effective way to produce affordable housing at the market level is to begin from this middle-out strategy. These kinds of units in a triplex or a fourplex are the cheapest to build and therefore the easiest to put on the market at something close to affordability. And it's not just Gill that suggests a richer history. The R.M. Schindler House on Kings Road in West Hollywood, a famous icon of early LA modernism, was actually designed around this idea of communal sharing space. And that, in this case, it was designed to host two families. Schindler and his wife and Richard Neutra, shown here, shared the house for several years before having a terrible falling out. They did have an amazing, somebody should do a film about this, speaking of movies, rapprochement near the end of their lives. Schindler was very sick, he was in the hospital. He and Neutra had this terrible falling out. because Schindler always felt that Neutra was stealing his work and stealing his clients. Schindler was in a room with 2 beds. The other patient was moved out in the middle of the night. A new patient was moved in. And sure enough, it was Richard Neutra. The 2 of them, you couldn't write that kind of a movie scene. No one would believe it. They had this conversation, sort of rapprochement. Schindler died not long after. Neutra went on to have quite a long and prolific career. But this notion of sharing space, the communal architecture of modernism, is something embedded in the history of Los Angeles that we can look back to. And in the more recent past, there's all kinds of fascinating experiments. This is the Hollywood duplex by the Australian-born architects, Koning Eisenberg, Hank Koning and Julie Eisenberg, who continue to do really remarkable, mostly housing-focused work in Los Angeles. So this is a project from the latter 80s. And a project that in some ways is quite different, but is a model for me as I think about how we want to organize this competition. This is the Moriyama House in Tokyo by Ryu Nishizawa. We're looking at triplexes and fourplexes. This is maybe a 10-plex, 10 individual units, all standalone on this corner location on the outskirts of Tokyo. A really remarkable project. It would be difficult, it goes without saying, I hope, in Los Angeles to build a project like this without changing our setback requirements and our parking requirements. But it does suggest that what we're doing, what we hope to do by thinking about new typologies in this sort of missing middle, is not just to think about density and infill, but also to bring flexibility to a housing stock that has been really rigid. So in Los Angeles, we have wide swaths of the city that continue to be zoned for single family only. And then we have swaths where we are pouring in significant density and really changing those neighborhoods. And we have yet to explore with much success a kind of middle ground. And yet if you talk to folks who live in an R1 neighborhood, even those who are very anxious about change and changes to zoning and new density, and ask them what they would like to see in their neighborhoods, they often talk about things like the ability to age in place, the ability to walk to stores, more eyes on the street, more security, more community, in neighborhoods that, in terms of where single-family neighborhoods are going, because of that rigidity, the population is getting older, is more fixed. There are very few opportunities for younger homeowners, renters, buyers to move into those neighborhoods. So this is a project where the owner was interested sometimes in just living in one unit and renting out the other 9 blocks of this puzzle, pieces of this puzzle. But it gives the ability to move kind of flexibility across these various zones and a kind of continuum of public and private space, which is very different from, remember that Hockney image, the kind of deeply privatized landscapes of the second Los Angeles. So the last project I want to talk about has to do with the LA River. The LA River also falls quite neatly into this 3 LAs framework. We have downtown Los Angeles where we have it because of the Los Angeles River. The first Tongva Native American settlements were along the river, which has always been a seasonal river across the Los Angeles basin, connecting the mountains and then flowing out to sea. And so the very geography of Los Angeles, both pre-Anglo LA and post, has everything to do with the location of the river. But it carries, as a seasonal river, most of the time it's dry, but because during periods of intense rain, major storm events, the water comes rushing down out of the foothills and the mountains and into this river. It began to flood with really disastrous results once the city began to be developed in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is a picture from the late 1930s, and you can find similar images from this period. One of the reasons for that is that the river has to negotiate in its 51 miles as it goes from the edge of the San Fernando Valley through downtown and down to Long Beach and the Pacific Ocean. It negotiates a bigger grade change in that 51 miles than the Mississippi River does for the entirety of its length. So it's a very intense negotiation of that grade change, which produces really significant flooding. In response to that, as the city grew up around the river, we infamously channelized all 51 miles. We wrapped it in this concrete straitjacket as a flood control measure. But the byproduct of that was to turn what had been one of the most important public spaces the source of the founding of Los Angeles, the source of LA's drinking water until 1913, in fact, into a privatized and largely invisible landscape. We fenced it along its entire length. We really made it disappear as a public amenity, a public space. We heard earlier about this sort of 20th century idea of infrastructural expertise, which turned all of these spaces into monocultures. This is the absolute epitome of that approach, which is to say, this is an infrastructural expression of incredible ambition to wrap 51 miles of river in concrete, but it also had one purpose and one purpose only. It was only for getting that stormwater out to sea during periods of intense rain. And of course, we don't have the luxury of sending all of our stormwater out to sea any longer, to say nothing of our need to develop more open space. As we heard, though, it does have a singular kind of character in terms of the role that it played in Hollywood cinema. This is a John Borman picture from 1967 called Point Blank with Lee Marvin as the star. This is the same year, 67, as that David Hockney painting, A Bigger Splash. And so now our challenge is to think about the pre-channelization river, the channelized concrete river, and the associations that we all have because of the way Hollywood and others have sort of captured that landscape. And that's a 20s, that's a first LA deco bridge in the background behind Lee Marvin. And so now it's a space where the first and second and third LAs are all wrapped up together. So this is a piece of land called the G2 parcel that the city bought about 2 years ago. It's 42 acres, open space, in almost the precise midsection of the river. So I mentioned the river is 51 miles long. This site is right at mile 25 and a half, 26, just upriver from downtown in a neighborhood called Cypress Park, across from a neighborhood called Frogtown. This piece of land, which you can see here, was part of an old rail facility called the Taylor Yard. So it is significant. It has significant environmental remediation, has lots of toxic soil that we need to clean up and deal with. But it is a huge opportunity for the city. It is connected on either side to state park land, so upriver to a piece of state park called the Bowtie Parcel, and then toward the hills to another state park piece called the Rio de Los Angeles State Park, which is also 40 acres. So we have the potential now to have more than 100 acres of contiguous new open space right in the heart of Los Angeles, along the Los Angeles River. And we're now working on what a design strategy might look like for this piece of land. So here, this gives you a better sense of where the river is, Rio de Los Angeles State Park, the Bowtie Parcel, sort of toward the top of the image, and G2, if you see that roundabout, there's a sort of radial part of the image at the center. That's the heart of the 42-acre parcel that we're now thinking about a design strategy for. So working in collaboration with the RiverWorks team within the mayor's office, which is a team dedicated to thinking about the future of the river and river policy, and our Bureau of Engineering and the council office in this part of LA, we're thinking, first of all, about a long-term design strategy for this piece, which will involve some habitat restoration, perhaps even pulling the banks of the river back and figuring out how to do this environmental remediation. But meanwhile, we want to get people to the site, to the edge of the river as quickly as possible. So we have brought in the Spanish architecture firm Selgas Cano from Madrid, and they are just producing some preliminary concepts for us to produce a viewing platform and a very basic, modestly budgeted project that will get people into this space along part of the site that has safer soil within, we hope the first platform of that project will be open to the public by the end of this year, and a little bit more of that interim project to be open next year. But this really is a landscape that suggests both the challenges and opportunities of this moment. It's also interesting to see the 5 freeway at left there in that image. So the great linear infrastructures of post-war LA, the second Los Angeles, are the freeway and the river. They share a certain logic. The freeway also, of course, a monoculture designed just to do one thing, just like the river. In the case of the freeway, to carry car traffic from point A to point B and not admit any other possibility in terms of program or use, connection to public space. And the river does something similar. So the challenge now is to think about an open space design strategy that will bring people to the site, that will give us an eye toward future strategy, but also really think about flood control and climate change. So one of the complexities of this issue is if we pull back the riverbank, there are chances that that will slow down the water, and then as the water accelerates leaving, going around the next bend of the river, that we may have flood control risk to think about. And in general, the storm events that we have now in climate change promise to be more intense. And so this notion of taking out all the concrete that you can see in a picture like this is not necessarily realistic. We have to bring a new landscape and greening strategy to this territory, but we also have to think always about being mindful of flood control along the entire length of the river. So it's really striking that balance that's going to be most important. And then finally, as Andrew said, when we invest in public spaces of this kind, in neighborhoods where there's been a lot of displacement, gentrification, housing pressures in terms of prices, we need to think about the unintended consequences or byproducts of that kind of investment. So we've all seen, looking at the High Line in New York City, that well-designed spaces can have unintended consequence in terms of the private capital that they draw. And so we need to have a larger conversation in this context about what housing policy looks like for this neighborhood, how we address in a really genuine, straightforward way these notions of anti-displacement, anti-gentrification strategies. It may sound like a lot to put on the design of a single public space, but I think what we're realizing now, as you've heard before this morning already, we need to have these more complex, even more fraught conversations about the relationships between, let's say, open space planning, transportation, and housing policy across the city. And as difficult as those conversations can be, I'm really encouraged by the extent to which LA and other cities are beginning to engage them. So I will leave it there. I will thank you for your attention and encourage you to be in touch. Thank you so much.